We're in business. Okay. Welcome, everybody. A few quick words of welcome to Andrew. Andrew is, of course, officially Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at NYU. I'm sure we could talk about that. I mean, I think it's a subset of American Studies.
No, it's the other way around.
It's the other way around. American subset is a subset of Social and Cultural Analysis. And between these two labels, one could sort of try to figure Andrew out. I think the main point is kind of really simple. He's an unbelievably good writer, thinker, and activist, and he's done an amazing job of confusing the difference between what it means to be a writer, a thinker, and an activist. And it's not simply a matter of writing in a way that is activist or that inspires activism. There is a sort of a project in what used to be called the streets, whereby what's written in books and what's going on in the streets or in institutions or in media, it's all part of the same thing in Andrew. And it's always been that way. So I think this is like book number 17 or something like that. And in every single case with every single book, I think you could never really pull it out and then locate it safely in any territory, like a university or any other area. But in all of that work, he's endlessly attentive to one question, I think, which is the question of labor. It's always there, and it's like his one love that he's absolutely sort of monogamous with, which is labor, but is entirely promiscuous in where that love is articulated. So there's really no forum that he doesn't consider appropriate, but more importantly, that people don't want him to participate in. So it can be in art journals, fashion journals, union journals, you name it, you will discover Andrew there. So I think this is something like what we used to imagine a public intellectual would be when we used to know what public meant and when we used to know what intellectual meant. And I think whatever I'm saying here is more or less that I think Andrew's on the front lines of the rethinking of the public and the rethinking of what it means to be an intellectual, and has done a sort of astonishing job of making all of those who would say that such figures don't exist look like idiots. And I think a big and important job of a writer is to not only be thoughtful, but to make evident the people that are being thoughtless. So I think sort of stupidity identification is a big part of our joint work. Of course, you probably know I'm speaking about very direct things like the anti-sweatshop movement work, the outsourcing work, the technology work, the globalism work, the weather work, and so on. But actually, if you really examine any of those projects, it's the same project, registered in different ways. Anyway, we're here to celebrate another step in this labor on labor, which is the book Bird on Wire, Lessons from the World's Least Sustainable City. You would have thought there were so many candidates that it would be just sort of thrilling to find out why the winner is Phoenix. And one other aspect of, there is, and of course I think of when you sort of lived inside Walt Disney for a while, there is this sort of urban anthropologist dimension to the work that's incredibly important, because of course, and this is obvious, but to the extent that we are no longer so sure what it means public and what it means intellectual, the question of the city starts to become really not very different from the question of labor. And you will notice that in Andrew's writing, there is a kind of urban, suburban, rural series of layers that are working up. So I think you can probably imagine that Phoenix will somehow slot itself into this analysis of the city. Again, if we're into sort of idiot identification, anybody who thinks that the question of labor is not the same as the question of what it means to live together in cities is an idiot, and you're welcome to leave now. Those of you who are here for good reasons. You're here because of Andrew, and it's a real pleasure that he's with us again tonight.
Thank you so much. It's a particular treat to be introduced by Mark Wigley, and thanks for inviting me here. Let me just preview for you how I'm going to be approaching the topic this evening. First of all, I'm going to offer can everyone hear me back there? Yeah?
Switch the mic.
To the mic. Oh, that's a good idea. That should be more, yes, that should be more audible. I'm going to be offering just a few remarks on a few tendencies that have emerged, that we've seen emerging in response to the climate crisis. Then I'll be focusing more directly on cities and the urban sustainability movement. And then lastly, I'll summarize some of my lessons, the lessons that I drew from my research in Phoenix, which was the field site for my research. The first tendency is the emergence of what I would call the carbon calculus as a numerical index of our ability to meet the climate crisis. For many people right now, the only relevant number is the one that records atmospheric carbon levels, currently at 390 parts per million. Can we afford to let this rise to 450? Should we hold the threshold at 400 or insist on reducing it to 350? For some climate activists, this is the only important question. And for those who favor the quickest form of carbon reduction, we must proceed by any means necessary, even if it involves following pathways that are undemocratic. Indeed, some prominent ecologists, James Lovelock, for example, has recently argued that to properly confront the threat of climate change, it may be necessary to put democracy on hold for a while. This belief that civil liberties should be suspended until action could be taken certainly has its advocates, especially among those who favor these top-down geoengineering schemes involving large-scale manipulation of the global energy balance, like seeding the oceans with iron, for example. Certainly, anything is worth considering if we are to win the race to decarbonize, but not if it puts us on some kind of authoritarian death march. Because I think we have to be clear, the failure to confront the climate crisis is not a failure of democracy, it's the result of the stranglehold of fossil capitalism on democracy. For most of us, the most everyday manifestation of this carbon calculus is the growing habit of assessing the carbon footprint of every single thing we do. Every personal act, every product. Indeed, quantifying the world's energy throughput on the micro level of personal conduct is fast becoming a pseudo-political obsession, and in many ways I see it as a kind of perverse spin on the tyranny of the statistical tyranny of the GDP, reducing all of our actions and our use of material things to a very dull data set, the outcome of which is a kind of moral assessment of our thermodynamic performance. Carbon neutral man is the goal here. A model of aesthetic behavior that is the exact opposite of the wasteful hyper-consumer. I don't know about you, but I'm inclined to reject much of the moralism associated with that ideal. Hydrocarbons should become an outlawed byproduct of our civilization, not its loud scourge. The second tendency is the emergence of green governance as a managerial mode, and this is a trend that's most easy to discern at the level of townships or cities, especially in the widespread adoption by city managers of sustainability programs and performance indicators. As in the corporate world, where every large firm now has a sustainability officer, these programs in City Hall have proven extremely useful as an administrative tool for institutional reorganizing. The City Hall's programs are ostensibly aimed at reforming the behavior of middle-class citizens, how we travel, where we live, what we eat, and perhaps most important, how we, as models of green conduct, can influence the more recalcitrant classes. New York City itself, some of you know about New York City's sustainability plan, is relatively late to the game. It was only adopted in 2007, and our mayor is best known in the public mind for policies aimed at behavior modification, eliminating smoking, even in public parks, banning trans fats in city eateries, barring the purchase of soda drinks by welfare recipients, and covering the city with bicycle lanes. Critics of his sustainability plan argue that it's driven directly by the development agenda of the fire industries, which shape the city's growth machine, and that it has no provision for addressing the city's chronic inequalities. You compare it to the London plan, the equivalent London plan, which revolves around social inclusion. There's no mention of that at all in New York City's sustainability plan. If those critics are right, then it serves as marketing cover for the intensification of growth in high-value locations, further contributing to a social geography that could be loosely described as eco-apartheid. And this is a term that I take from Van Jones, and I find it kind of useful or valuable to think about what that means. What does it mean? Well, increasingly, what we're seeing is how investment patterns, neoliberal investment patterns, consumer niche marketing, and government policies favored by moneyed voters are succeeding in fostering showpiece pockets of green living in our big cities, in certain neighborhoods. But these oases, these green oases, increasingly coexist with human and natural sacrifice zones on the other side of the tracks, where populations still have to fight to breathe clean air and drink uncontaminated water. The third tendency emerges from the opportunity offered by the Great Recession to launch a new industrial revolution powered by renewable energy. In the absence of any other candidates, green industrial policies, green collar industrial policies were prioritized as a recipe for recovery, and they were supported by an international wave of eco-Keynesianism in the first half of 2009. And in some countries, this warm vision of reindustrialization still persists. But in the US, at least, it didn't take long for the oil, gas, and coal lobbies to succeed in rendering the term climate change all but persona non grata on Capitol Hill. Today we know that eco-Keynesianism is struggling to survive in the new climate of austerity politics. As for the private sector, there you will find that it is still widely understood, or it's still widely believed, that green capitalism might be a highly profitable undertaking, at least in the short run. Proponents of green capitalism argue that putting a proper price on all natural resources is the best way of protecting the renewable ones. And so they promote the view that a post-fossil economy can be sufficiently driven by the market segment known as LOHAS. LOHAS stands for Lifestyles of Health and Sustainability. That's a market that is estimated globally at $500 billion and covers almost 20% of adult consumers in the OECD countries. So LOHAS evangelists more or less assume that reforming the high carbon consumption of that 20%, folks like us, alone may be enough to stave off the scenarios of eco-collapse. The last tendency, or the fourth one, flows from the concept of climate justice and focuses on the debt owed to underdeveloped countries for hosting an uneven share of the pollution emitted by the carbon-rich beneficiaries of industrialization. Climate justice challenges green capitalism's assumption that the advanced economies can solve the climate problem on their own through focusing on this 20% market segment of production and consumption. However, the sociology of climate change has made it quite clear that no one can opt out, just as no one can be left behind. In addition, climate justice, like the most effective social movements, is driven by an abolitionist goal. In this case, it's the abolition of an oppressive debt, which imposes the most negative impacts of climate change on the most vulnerable and marginal populations. Climate justice so far has been applied at the international level, or the level of the nation-state system, because of the legal attention garnered by international treaty agreements and conventions. But I think in many ways the spirit of climate justice lies very close to home. It's visible in the unequal distribution of resources even in our own backyards. So, for example, when students and other indignados, even down there on Wall Street now, faced with brutal cuts in education and services when they declare, we won't pay for your crisis, it certainly has a different meaning than when representatives of the G77 bloc of developing nations make the same kind of declaration at a UN climate summit. But there's a sort of horizontal kinship between the two declarations, a very strong one, and they're both refusals to accept the loading of debt, either financial or ecological, onto vulnerable populations in the global south or here in the north. Why are cities a solution? Perhaps you've noticed that climate activists and public officials keep returning from these UN climate summits in a very deep funk about government inaction. Even if the political obstacles to carbon policy making were to rapidly dissolve overnight, many thoughtful people have already concluded that it may already be too late to take meaningful steps to avert drastic climate change. Better to accept the foreseeable consequences by trying to anticipate and adapt to the worst-case scenarios. Indeed, any sober reading of the IPCC's periodic bulletins about the slow eco-apocalypse underway would support this very conclusion. And for those of you who know Gramsci's motto, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, that was never more relevant than to the uncertain domain of climate politics. For those of us who are allergic to despair, and I hope there's many of you in the audience, we look to cities for evidence that progress is being made. The C40 Climate Leadership Group, which comprises 40 of the largest cities in the world, collaborating on decarbonization programs, issued its own urgent plea to the major carbon powers in Copenhagen at the climate summit. Today, wherever you will find that there is a thriving sustainable cities movement all over the developed world and in many developing countries. City mayors toot their horn whenever their cities move up the national sustainability rankings. There are many indexes that do these rankings. And it's fair to say that there's a kind of race afoot right now to claim the mantle of America's greenest city. Why cities? Well, unlike state and federal lawmakers who rule on energy regulation, mayors and city managers are not in a position to be swayed. They don't have to be influenced, targeted by fierce lobbying power of the fossil industries. So to some degree, they're more free to push green policies. And if the policies lead to efficiencies and fiscal relief for cash-strapped city halls, then the result is probably a double win. Cities, without doubt, statistically speaking, are on the front line. They generate 80% of the world's emissions, and it's only in dense urban environments that low-carbon living is possible on a mass scale. Even without a decisive shift in energy supply, more compact patterns of urban development can deliver a jumbo boost to decarbonization. Now, if you look at the literature on the scholarship on sustainable cities, you find that a lot has been written about showpieces, environmental showpieces like Portland or Curitiba or Reykjavik or Freiburg or even Singapore, the success stories. Their success in sustaining and in attaining their sustainability goals are very much emulated. More vulnerable or recalcitrant places have other things to teach us, how we go about making green decisions, or whether we even have the wherewithal to make the right ones. And that's why I chose to do my research and write this book about the struggles of Phoenix, Arizona, to become a resilient metropolis. Phoenix is faced with much larger environmental challenges and considerably more resistance from its elected officials than havens of green consciousness like Seattle or San Francisco, and that's why I think Phoenix may prove to be a more useful bellwether of sustainability for us. If Phoenix can become sustainable, then it can be done anywhere. That was a working premise of my research that drove my investigations. And even if it's not the world's least sustainable city, it's a very close contender. And in any event, I don't think the title is worth arguing over. But the case is certainly there to be made. More than any other U.S. metropolis, Phoenix, which until recently was the fifth largest U.S. city, has channeled the national appetite for unrestrained growth. And we know that American habit of growth is consuming a vastly disproportionate share of the Earth's resources, including its carbon allotment. And if there's any chance of altering that pattern significantly, then the effort has to show up in regions like this. This region is 1,000 square miles of urban sprawl in central Arizona. The challenges are quite formidable there. Less than 7 inches of rain annually. Its most dependable water supplies are pumped 300 miles uphill from the over-allocated and drought-beset flow of the Colorado River. The region is deluged with over 330 days of bright sunshine, but only a tiny percentage of its energy is drawn from solar sources. And from 1990 to 2007, Arizona, as a state, increased its carbon emissions faster than any other American state at a rate more than 3 times the national average. It was once a haven for TB sufferers seeking respiratory relief. By 2005, the city's infamous brown cloud was drawing the lowest national grades from the American Lung Association for air quality in both ozone and particulates. And of all U.S. cities, Phoenix flew the highest in the race to profit from the housing bubble, and it's fallen the furthest as a result of the speculator-driven land crash. But the only real driver of growth, the only real driver of the economy in Phoenix is growth. It's home building. It's the core industry, and these are just some pictures of tumbleweed subdivisions on the urban fringe, where all the roads and street signs and so on and so forth have all been built. But it's all being reclaimed now by tumbleweed and sage and so on and so forth. Tumbleweed is a very interesting plant. It's not native to the region, contrary to Hollywood mythology. And it reproduces by tumbling. It's a very interesting plant. Well, to cap it all, the city already boasts the hottest summer temperatures in the Northern Hemisphere, and it happens to be in the bullseye of climate change in the hemisphere, predicted to heat up and dry out faster than any other region. In fact, this summer's August was the hottest on record. Even the scorpions were staying out of the sun, which resulted in a noticeable spike in indoor scorpion stings. Even after decades of lavish federal spending on public works and water infrastructure, decades of defense industry payrolls that underpinned the rise of the Sun Belt, even after all of this government assistance, the stark vulnerability of Phoenix's Sonoran Desert habitat makes it a very questionable location for 4 million people, let alone the 9 million people predicted to live in the megapolitan region in the years to come. And that megapolitan region is a corridor called the Sun Corridor, stretching from Tucson to Phoenix, actually above Phoenix to below Tucson. Now, that said, many of the world's fastest growing cities are also in semi-arid regions. And so as climate change intensifies, they will share the same destiny as Metro Phoenix. So the lessons learned from central Arizona may turn out to be applicable all over the world, but especially in the swelling megacities of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Some of you might be interested in methodology. What methodologies do you adopt if you are researching the sustainability of a sprawling metro region. I've written several book-length ethnographies, but they were studies of relatively banded communities, small town in Florida, new media company in New York, a skilled labor market in East China. But I found that Metro Phoenix was a much harder nut to crack. And so after completing my preliminary research, I decided I would target and interview 200. I set a target of 200 of the city's more thoughtful, influential, and active citizens. And they would be, full-length interviews about the region's prospects for becoming sustainable. I aimed for very broad coverage. I cast a very wide net for interviewees, state lawmakers, government professionals in urban planning and economic development, real estate brokers and attorneys, policy analysts, land developers and home builders, nonprofit operatives, small business owners, civil rights champions, energy lobbyists, solar entrepreneurs, engineers and technicians, utility regulators, industrial ecologists, banking economists, artists, curators and gallerists, community activists, affordable housing providers, land trust officials, opinion journalists, urban farmers, archaeologists, tribal activists, green business advocates, environmental justice watchdogs, trade unionists, university administrators, and last but not least, a variety of scholars in the sustainability field. I combined their experience and knowledge of the metropolis from the interviews with my own assessment of the strength and quality of the appetite for change. And the result was supposed to give me a composite picture of the region's potential for a greener future, and probably more important, the obstacles that lay in the path. So from a methodological perspective, this was qualitative ethnography I was doing, and the advantage I found was that qualitative ethnography offers an alternative to over-reliance on the sustainability indicators that city managers use they use to rate their performance. And they tend to be checklists that conform to managerial norms of measurement because they're made up of easily quantifiable items. So this year we had more solar roofs, less airborne particulates, we had more transit riders, less water use per capita, we had more housing density, less golf courses, and so on and so forth. Those are the kinds of stats, the metrics that go into sustainability indicators. Metrics like these convey, what do they convey? They convey a purely physical understanding of how cities can be greened, suggesting that the ecological crisis can be fixed by making slight technical adjustments to people's habits and interactions with their daily environment. By contrast, there are no indexes, there are no metrics for measuring environmental justice. There's no technical quantum for assessing the social sustainability of a population. And yet, among the findings of my research was that the key to urban sustainability lies less in physical or technical fixes than in aspects of social cooperation, such as whether communities can learn to renounce self-interested hoarding of resources and practice something approaching mutual aid, whether the well provision can respond in kind to the environmental claims of the poor by strengthening democratic input and inclusion, whether they can promote access and participation for populations who are habitually ignored by the green marketing of the LOHAS-based private sector, or by the green city campaigning of City Hall, or whether officials themselves in City Hall can accept or will accept the risk levels of the most vulnerable populations, the canaries in the mine, as the baseline for formulating green policies and reforms. Now, all of these things you could say are elements of social character. If it's possible to talk about the social character of a metropolis. I know that's a difficult concept to get your mind But there are elements of social character, and trying to measure them, of course, is absurd. It's like counting grains of sand with a fork. And so the qualitative methods that I decided to adopt, I found them useful also in a field that's dominated by environmental scientists who tend to use quantitative methods in addition. So on issue after issue, I found that Phoenix was a textbook example of deficits in equity, and that City Hall's efforts at green governance was primarily a recipe for managing rather than correcting inequalities. The most obvious example was the distribution of pollution hazards in Phoenix, which show a long-standing pattern of burden loaded against Indian reservations or poor neighborhoods dominated by minorities. Communities that have been treated as dumping grounds for waste disposal and noxious industry are a world apart from those who can afford the aromatic desert breeze and mountain preserves of North Scottsdale or Paradise Valley, which is up here basically. This is a regional map of the Phoenix Basin, and there are two large rivers that drain into the basin here, which is the reason why Phoenix is there in the first place. And the topography tilts up towards the mountains. And the lowest lying areas here are in South Phoenix, the old floodplains of the Salt River. And that's where the communities are that are most burdened with hazards and noxious industry. There's nothing sustainable in the long run about one population one population up here living the green American dream in Scottsdale and home now of Sarah Palin, and the relatively affluent East Valley cities over here compared to the downtown south of the Salt River areas of South Phoenix. Nothing sustainable about one population living the green American dream, while across town another one is trapped in pestilence. The low-lying geography of South Phoenix hosts the single dirtiest postal code in America, and is actually home to 40% of the city's hazardous industrial emissions. And it's not just in this area, but also in some of the inner ring suburbs, the Cold War inner ring suburbs, that you find the legacy of the gun belt in groundwater contamination. Cold War technology industries that were the basis for the rise of the Sun Belt in cities like Phoenix left a terrible legacy. Let me show you a map that I had made up of some of the contamination plumes in the aquifers beneath Phoenix. Some of the worst are from Motorola. Motorola was the biggest employer in defense industry employment in the Cold War, and left some of the worst contamination when it no longer functions in the area at all, but it was the single biggest employer for a long time. If you go and look at the Arizona Department of Environmental Quality site, you'll find maps of single plumes, single site maps. But they, for some reason, which I'm sure you can figure out, they never put them together in one map. So I took the liberty of doing that, or having someone do it, just so that you could see the extent of the contamination in the aquifer. And this plume in particular, which is a few sites that merge, is at least 15 miles long and flows right down through the center of downtown Phoenix. Now, it is, by contrast, it's populations in the northern reach, the affluent northern reaches of the region, that you find most of the green technical innovations on the market are targeted. They're being marketed to the more affluent populations, the solar technologies, the hybrid cars, the low impact landscaping, the green building techniques and the like, adding to the range of eco options already available to their affluent residents. They're sort of like the environmental equivalent of new apps for their iPhones. So the question is, how do we prevent these eco-enclaves, these areas turning into eco-enclaves, hoarding resources and knowledge about sustainability or about resilience from others? Either the green wave has to lift all boats, or else we find ourselves back in the very dismal lifeboat ethic, which was first proposed by Garrett Hardin back in the 1970s, where those already not on board are left behind. Now, a similar lesson about equity applied to the other flashpoints around which I broke down my research: the urban growth machine, downtown revitalization, water management, solar energy, and immigration policy. Living in the fastest growing post-war metropolis in the US, a lot of Phoenix residents' concerns about the costs of urban sprawl, as you can imagine, have multiplied over the years. But typically, these anxieties have revolved around the toll on non-renewable water supplies, the impact on air quality of commuting patterns, and encroachment on fragile desert ecosystems. By contrast, this steady transfer of resources, amenities, and wealth away from the center city to the suburbs and the 20 satellite cities that ring Phoenix have attracted much less attention, as environmental concerns, planning, taxation, and energy policies that favor low-density suburban life were clearly tilted against the needs and aspirations of center city residents, whose neighborhoods are now food deserts, far removed from decent employment and amenity centers. And the kinds of green modifications that you find being made now to upscale master plan communities on the urban fringe, or at least those that are still being built, there's very little building going on in the region. These are not going to remedy the indifference. This is a shot of Verrado, which is a new urbanist community. It's about 30 miles from downtown, way out in the desert and the mountains. And as a compact site in and of itself, of course, it promotes its sustainability, but its location is not going to make it, if anything, will enlarge the carbon footprint of the region. Especially if modifications to these master plan communities give a new lease of life to the growth machine. By contrast, a concerted program of investment, of green investment in the hundreds of vacant lots that dot central city areas in Phoenix would transform and humanize the character of a metropolis, which is currently in the deepest financial hole of any large US city. Now, for most urban planners and quality of life advocates, downtown revitalization, as I'm sure you know, is the preferred antidote to sprawl, and it has not bypassed Phoenix. There's been a big battle over downtown Phoenix, and artist communities have played a very influential role in that battle. They were able to complicate, if not entirely transcend, the role they usually play in other cities as involuntary agents of gentrification. Contending with developers bent on refurbishing downtown for a new money class, a lot of these artists became urban activists in their own right. These artist activists push for municipal policies that favor what they call the sustainable downtown, featuring income diversity, affordable housing, mixed-use zoning, and fine-grained planning. And they found that they could get heard at City Hall, partly because of their skin color and education and cultural capital, and their tactics, which were quite inventive. But that ability to get heard at City Hall was not matched by the low-income residents of downtown areas, many of whom are now being chased out of town by the crackdown on immigrants. Unless the needs of these residual residents are adopted as priorities, the resulting destabilization of their neighborhoods will leave them almost as vulnerable as the victims of subprime lending, who, at least in Phoenix, are now stranded on the urban fringe. Because in Phoenix, during the housing boom, you drove till you qualified, because the land is cheapest at the urban fringe, and so a lot of low-income families found themselves way out in the desert on the urban fringe and are now stranded there in the foreclosure belts of the outer rings. Here is here's a shot which gives you a sense of a downtown ecology. It's actually not that untypical in many American cities, you know. Here's a vacant lot here. Vacant lots are very expensive land. That's one of the reasons they're vacant. They'll be vacant for a long, long time in Phoenix. So you got the vacant lots, you got an artist's zone, kind of transitional zone there, highly colorful. These are some of the new fancy condo urban lofts that were built at the peak of the housing boom. And then behind them, downtown banks and business hotels in the central business district. So you have these sort of four zones of downtown ecology. Some advertising for these lofts. Water. As I'm sure you know, vigilance about water scarcity is inherent in the far western lifestyle. And central Arizona's growth machine depends on successful efforts to secure supplies from remote sources. The upper Colorado is in the 12th year of a serious drought, and Phoenix is in the dead center of U.S. climate change. So the cost of bringing in what they call the next bucket of water is sure to rise and escalate very rapidly. If and when water shortages begin to show up, what will be tested is the capacity of crosstown communities to cooperate, to share their supplies with each other. That will be the test of resilience and mutual aid. The Hohokam irrigation civilization that subsisted for 1,000 years in the Phoenix Basin before Phoenix was built up in the late 19th century. And that civilization subsisted around a vast canal network. That civilization faced a similar test of regional cooperation and ultimately failed. The Hohokam became archaeologically invisible, as they say, in the 15th century, joining the growing list of ancient riverine civilizations that did not respond well, sociologically speaking, that did not respond well to the tightening of resources. These are a shot of reconstructed pit houses near the Sky Harbor Airport. All prudent estimates suggest it's not too late to discourage, through taxation and other kinds of pricing, it's not too late to discourage growth on the urban periphery of populations that will be most hard hit by water shortages. Renewable energy. Central Arizona has some of the best solar exposure in the world, and so fledgling plans to harness the state's most abundant natural resource are the only major hope for economic recovery, currently stymied by the over-reliance in the home building industry. And these plans hinge on the ability to create green-collar jobs that pay a living wage. Yet the extremist right-wing politics of the state legislature and also the monopolistic might of the major utility companies stand in the way. Efforts to jumpstart this renewable sector don't have comprehensive government support at a time when they're most needed. No less contested is the fact that there's a very bold requirement that Arizona has for distributed energy generation, which is set by the state's utility commission. It has the largest quota that's mandated for distributed energy generation, which means, you know, solar roofs basically. And independent household production of energy has a lot of appeal, a lot of populist appeal, especially in the West. But local citizen control over clean energy provision can only come about by dismantling the monopoly of the utilities, along with their funding structure for rooftop generations. Currently, everyone who is connected to the utility pays a surcharge to fund distributed solar energy, which means it's basically a regressive tax on renters and poor homeowners who can't afford to put panels on their roofs. There's a lot of interest and a lot of efforts to innovate solar technology systems. This is one project that I followed in the book, funded by the state's richest person, John Sprawling, who was the founder of the University of Phoenix, for-profit university. He's put a lot of his money into developing this system, which doesn't use any water at all. It uses off-peak wind power, salt caverns, and bioengineered sorghum. It's a very complicated system. It's called SolarCat. The last object of my investigations was immigration policy, or anti-immigration policy would be more accurate in the case of Arizona. It's the one that has sparked the most corrosive public sentiment. Some of you will know that U.S. border policy is designed to funnel border crossers towards Arizona. Why? Because the prospect of dying in the deserts and mountains of southern Arizona are supposed to act as a deterrent to border crossers. The state's increasingly harsh anti-immigration laws are based on the principle of attrition through enforcement, which is a euphemism for make everyday life so intolerable that they will leave. And these policies and laws have attracted widespread international attention, and even more draconian laws are on their way. Here's a typical, here's a sign from Sheriff Joe Arpaio's, the self-styled toughest sheriff in America. These signs are carried on all of the Maricopa County police trucks. A lot of the laws, the anti-immigration laws, are spurred by the anxiety of Anglos about losing demographic and political dominance to the burgeoning Latino population. But the inhospitable responses behind them are also shaped by what you could call neo-Malthusian fears about population pressure on scarce resources. And one of the things I found in my research was that there was already a causal environmental link between Arizona's undocumented migrants and climate change, which means that their Anglo-tormentors have a sort of unwitting direct relationship with the migrants. Climate change is obviously not just affecting Arizona. It has no regard for borders. So it is fast drying out northern Mexico, and some portion of the border crossers to Arizona can already be classed as climate migrants or climate refugees. In effect, the carbon emissions that are pumped up into the desert air above Phoenix are responsible, however indirectly, they are responsible for displacing the migrants from their land and livelihoods. So there is a causal link there. Given that causal link, the border crossers should have a legitimate claim and sanctuary. In other words, they should have their own carbon-conscious version of the retort that was offered first by post-colonials when they settled in cities like London and Paris, which went, "We are here because you were there." There's a carbon-conscious version of that which the climate migrant has if you allow them to express it. Yet, the response is a nativist response for the most part. Nativists seem hell-bent on turning Arizona into the kind of exclusion zone that is very distinctive of resource hoarding. So I concluded that Arizona's bitter fight over immigration was the first real skirmish in the climate wars to come, when the threat of global warming will increasingly be used to shape immigration policies. around a vision of affluent nations or regions as heavily fortified resource islands. This is the border zone in southern, this is Sabi border crossing in southern Arizona. You can see this service road rises towards the mountains, and a lot of the activity among the border patrol is on the flats, is on the low-lying areas, is intended to push border crossers up into the mountains where they're more likely to die. One of my visits, I went with a Samaritan, one of a group of Tucson activists who leaves water bottles out in the desert on migrant trails. And this fellow was arrested, a celebrated court case. He was arrested for littering the desert because of what he did. He won the court case eventually, but the court case turned on the definition of what garbage is. It didn't turn on the issue of what humanitarianism was or what Samaritan behavior could be. Anyway, I went down there with him and I asked him just to show me how easy it was to climb the border fence. And sure enough, he scaled it in a few seconds. 2 minutes later, there were helicopters buzzing overhead. We were surrounded by border patrol trucks, very bellicose guards threatening indefinite detention because we were aiding and abetting aliens, as they put it. So luckily, the border guard showed up who had arrested this guy and recognized him and realized that you didn't really want to mess with this guy. Because of the legal consequences. So that day, at least, we were lucky enough to go free. Is this enclave mentality that I sketched out, this resource hoarding enclave mentality, already at work? Well, internationally, you could say the ugly side of the debate about emissions has centered on who has the right to go on polluting and which portions of the world's population will be sacrificed. Even as cities in affluent countries compete with each other in the sustainability rankings, I think the same kinds of triage calculations are already being made locally about which populations will be protected and which will be cut loose and sacrificed. And Arizona's Latinos, who are a burgeoning 30% of the state's population, have been put on notice about which triage category they are destined for. And the trauma and the stigma of their criminalization under these laws may well endure for generations. This guarantee that race relations will be toxic for many years to come does not augur well for social sustainability. And so I think the lesson offered by Arizona's treatment of immigrants will be instructive to other regions as and when climate migration escalates. Now, I want to end on a more optimistic note. One of the things I developed in the book was a case study of the Gila River Indian community. And that is basically this area of land here. It's a huge chunk of almost completely undeveloped land that sits directly in the growth of path of the Sun Corridor that runs from Phoenix down to Tucson. It's a 360,000 acre chunk of land. The Akimel Odom are Pima Indians, who are the dominant group on the reservation, actually claim descent from the pre-Columbian Hohokam. And they were oasis farmers. They were irrigation farmers in the 19th century, among other things. And they're kind of famous in the annals of the Anglo annals of American Indian history because they were lionized for helping to rescue and provision Anglo immigrants who were bound for the California gold rush, who went through the Gila Trail on the way to California. Basically what happened was in the late 19th century, upriver Anglo settlers began to cut off the Gila's natural river flow And this is a, oh, sorry. Yeah, you can see the Gila that runs through the reservation here. Upriver here, mostly Mormon settlers cut off the river flow. The Pima were rendered destitute as a result. Their health declined rapidly, and today, in fact, this small tribal population hosts the world's highest incidence of adult onset diabetes. So they're very much studied by that sector of the medical community that studies diabetes. For 80 years, however, they waged war in the courts to regain their water until a settlement, a water rights settlement in 2004 brought their struggle, a long struggle for environmental justice, to a triumphal conclusion. And as a result of the settlement, it's the largest Indian water rights settlement in the U.S. The community has won almost 25% of the state's water allocation from the Colorado River. And it intends to use the water rights to restore as much as 150,000 acres of farmland. So delivering justice to the Pima Indians has meant that a large portion of the region's still available water supplies will be sequestered from the growth machine. Instead of supplying a new generation of low-density tract housing along this sun corridor, the water can now be used, ideally, to produce healthy local food for the population of central Arizona. And if non-industrial agriculture prevails on the reservation, that's by no means a foregone conclusion, the result will be a double win for carbon reduction. Surely this is how a green polity ought to act, redressing the claims of those who have been aggrieved, and doing it in a way that extends long-term benefits for everyone, and not just those who are aggrieved. Now, I end on this note because I would argue that if all responses to environmental injustice were able to follow suit, this could be a very welcome model for moving forward. I understand and appreciate that it's unlikely to be replicated in other places. It's a very specific example, but it's the spirit of the example the guiding spirit of it that I think is a very sound one and an instructive one. What if the key to sustainability lies in innovating healthy pathways out of poverty for populations at risk, rather than marketing green gizmos to those who already have many options to choose from? These are, and I'm not presenting these as mutually exclusive options, of course, but the lessons I took away from my research convinced me of the pressing need for clear alternatives to the eco-apartheid system, or syndrome, that afflicts Phoenix and many other large cities. Building a low-carbon economy by targeting only the LOHAS demographic will end up doing little more than adding a green gloss to patterns of chronic inequality. Likewise, placing all of our faith in clean tech fixes tends to cede too much decision-making power to a closed circle of experts who, regardless of their technical prowess, generally, it turns out, have very little power to prevent the uneven application of their solutions, let alone the unintended consequences of their solutions. So, why don't I end there? Let me just show you two images. This is an image that I started with. It's actually a wonderful piece of earth art, if you were wondering about it. It was done at the height of the housing boom by a local artist called Matthew Moore. He grew up in his family farm, which is on the urban fringe of the West Valley in Phoenix. And he realized that since the urban fringe had almost reached his farm, that it was going to get sold off, because that's what happens. And so he grew a field in which the houses are grown of sorghum and the roads are black-bearded wheat, and this is in the shape of a model of the first subdivision that would go on on the field, sort of a biting commentary on the formula at the heart of the growth machine, which depends on the conversion of farmland into low-density tract housing. And a lot of developers love this image, by the way. Everybody loves it. And the last image is of something called the Phoenix Burn, which is an annual art world ritual unapproved by City Hall, which takes place at an undisclosed location. The mayor's office doesn't like unauthorized burnings. In this there's an elaborately handcrafted phoenix, which is put to the flame by an anarchist-styled art collective known as Thought Crime. They were an interesting group. They were chased out of Tempe, neighboring Tempe, by the police, who labeled them as Satanists, and they practice the art of fire performance, and they insist on the rejuvenating spiritual qualities of the burning phoenix, which is quite at odds with the cyclical land economics typically associated with Phoenix, which is, speculate, crash, and burn, speculate, crash, and burn. And this moment it's unclear whether there will be any uptick on the cycle, because no one currently sees any way to speculate their way out of the crash and the burn that they're still living through. There are many neighborhoods now that where housing values have declined by 80% or more, and that some real estate commentators have more or less declared they're beyond recovery. So this concept of being beyond recovery is one that really lies at the heart of this notion of unsustainability. I'll end there. Thank you.
So Phoenix recently invested in a light rail mass transit line. And I was just wondering if you consider that a green gizmo, or is that sort of more of an earnest attempt to, follow a more sort of sustainable growth pattern?
It's a good question. I mean, a lot of people collected look like Phoenix to try and get that light rail line built, and some island resistance to it. It's a very the populations that are served by it are light in number, light in traffic, served by New York City standards. But it was basically designed to bring people into the downtown area, not necessarily only commuters, but people who find some reason to come back downtown. And thank you. And it's the volume of ridership has been considerably greater than they estimated. And some of the satellite cities have plans to extend the line, certainly into Tempe, into Mesa. Scottsdale, no. People in Scottsdale don't want light transit. And I think it speaks to the kind of mindset of the Scottsdale vision of sustainability, because there's a population there that can afford a highly individualized model of sustainability. That's where you find most of the solar panels. That's where you find the passion for green building. Scottsdale has one of the most successful green building codes and policies in the nation. And a passion for xeriscaping, desert landscaping, and for open space preservation, the kinds of things that fit with a certain kind of lifestyle. But there are other elements of what we think of as sustainable urbanism, light rail or mass transit being one of them, that community does not want. So on the checklist of items that are usually mentioned as part of a menu of sustainability components that cities or communities can cherry pick from. As you can imagine, affluent communities like Scottsdale will make different choices than other kinds of communities. And whether it adds up to a picture of sustainable urbanism for everyone is another matter. So it's a sort of long-winded response to your question, but it takes us into terrain, I think, that is reflective of the issues I brought up.
Where do you see Phoenix going in the future, 25, 50 years from now? You painted a pretty bleak picture of potential water crisis. I mean, is this kind of a negative downward spiral, or is this going to continue to grow? Are people still going to want to live there?
Well, again, a good question. I'm not really in the prediction business. My job was to to build up an assessment based on the observations of the residents, the people who think about that locally. And one of the things I found interesting was that very, very few of my interviewees had a vision of eco-collapse for Phoenix that approximated what a lot of outsiders think when they think of Phoenix. A lot of outsiders like to think of Phoenix as simply disappearing into the desert. And it was kind of instructive to me because, I mean, we live in a city here where New Yorkers take great pleasure in imagining the apocalyptic destruction of the city by one method or another. I mean, there's a long list of books and movies that perform that fantasy on our behalf. Max Page has a very good book, a recent book about those. And usually it's a kind of sudden apocalyptic event, which is not, as we know, how eco-apocalypse happens. It's very slow. It's already underway, as we know. But no one in Phoenix really had that vision of the future, which is kind of surprising. The people who came closest to it were naturalists who studied other species, and who, like the director of the Phoenix Zoo, for example, I remember, who was trying to entertain the prospect of such self-destructive behavior on the part of this species, the human species in Phoenix. Why it would enter into such self-destructive behavior. And he thought that this was very irrational and not how a species should behave. The species that you could just as well call Phoenix man, right? And so he imagined that the population would shrink to about 40,000. But he was one of the very few. 40,000 happened to be the population peak of the Hohokam civilization that pre-existed Phoenix. And the only movie I could come across that came close to this was actually, there's a Harlan Ellison novel which was made into a movie called A Boy and His Dog in the 1970s. Anyone see A Boy and His Dog? It's a kind of early Don Johnson vehicle. And cute but deeply misogynistic movie about the sort of recreation of a kind of white-bread Kansas artificial community beneath Scottsdale, but there's no evidence of life above the surface in the movie. Scottsdale has disappeared.
The children of those people who have moved there grow up and sort of claim that as their own city, that the city will get better? Because it seems like when people move from other places, they don't really care what happens. So
Yeah.
I think
Well, that perception I found to be very popular among people who had lived there for a long time, or who had families that had been there for a long time. This kind of deep, abiding contempt for more recent arrivals, amenity migrants, as they're often called, or Alzheimer home buyers, as the real estate brokers often call them. And this is not untypical, certainly, of retiree gateway communities. That there is this contempt for recent arrivals, and since a lot of the people in the public mind are retirees, there is that assumption that they're not there to care about the city, and they don't devote themselves to ameliorating urbanism there. The statistics, however, belie this. The average age of a Phoenician is lower than the national average. It's actually quite a young city demographically, despite this reputation in the public mind. But in a city, and again, this is typical of boom cities, housing boom cities, boomburgs, as they're often called. The rapid turnover, I mean, the economic engine of these kinds of places means that they are equipped for the rapid turnover of population, even more rapid than what is already very rapid in the American demographic generally. You know, Americans move every 5 years. Homeowners move every 7 years. In Phoenix, the rate of turnover has always been higher than the national average. That's not happening right now. The population, I think, is shrinking a little bit, but it is not shrinking as much as it would be if people could afford to move. So people are captive right now in Phoenix. They cannot move because their equity is so far underwater from the mortgage crisis and foreclosure crisis.
After doing this research, what do you see yourself doing in terms of what you found after writing this book? Is this like an ongoing project of yours, or are you like closing the book, so to speak, and moving on to something else? Or I guess, how do you plan on acting on what you found?
Well, I'm going back to Phoenix to talk about the book, first thing, face the music. And I think a lot of the answer to your question really will follow on from the reception of the book in Phoenix. You know, there's a long history of the commissioning of outsiders to come in and do reports on the prospects for growth and development in a city like Phoenix. And I certainly didn't see myself in that lineage. I was originally commissioned actually by an arts research institute to come in and do whatever kind of research I wanted as long as it was arts related. So I started this project by studying the artist communities that had become activists on the back of the creative city paradigm in Phoenix, and the project from there. So I wasn't really commissioned to do the book as a report, but there is a long history of folks having been brought in to do that, and then the results being used in one fashion or another. They often are, inevitably, by different factions. They're usually commissioned by the Chamber of Commerce or by economic development agencies that are looking for ways to legitimize growth at a moment when the growth machine is flagging. Now my book obviously is none of these things, so how it will be received and used will be interesting to see. I'm up for it. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I have a question that's more about, I guess it's a quantitative question about census data. Since recent analysis of the last 10 years of census data has shown an increase in poverty and clearly a gap, as we now know, over the last 30 years between rich and poor, right? And so that the middle class is essentially either most of it's sliding downward, and few are able to move upward. And I was curious whether or not, given the time that you spent in Phoenix prior to the release of all this quantitative data, whether or not you could kind of sense that going on, or is the still sort of cultural illusion representations of certain middle class lifestyles prevalent, and common? so that people might be poor, but they see themselves clearly within the middle class.
Mhm.
And whether that was in all part of what you discovered in talking to people and sort of traveling around the
Yeah.
city.
It's again, it's a good question. The Phoenix metro region has actually some of the highest income disparities of any metro region in the U.S.
So it was a bellwether for all the statistics.
Well,
Yeah.
in the last 20 years or so, that ratio has really, class polarization has really increased well beyond, I think, the national rate. And certainly during the housing boom, the only thing really that kept people afloat and has kept working people and the lower middle class people in this country afloat was the provision of debt and loans, cheap money. And now that all of that is gone, there is a lot of desperation. The joblessness is I think it's one of the top 3 regions in terms of the decline in employment. And increasingly, people are talking about the comparison with Detroit. There were a few of my interviewees who did actually see Phoenix possibly become a 21st century Detroit. It is a one-industry town, like Detroit was, and the big difference being that a lot of the vacant lots in Detroit are being pulled into the urban farming movement and the urban agriculture movement. I found, and one of the things I did focus on was the urban farming movement, the embryonic urban farming movement in Phoenix. The lots that had been turned into community gardens and were being worked tended to be in South Phoenix because they were not expensive lots. The ones in the central city, which are most obvious to you when you go to visit Phoenix, will probably not be used. They're too expensive to be used, and the city won't allow them to be used because, once you let a vacant lot be used for a community garden, it's almost impossible to retrieve it for some other land use. So that's where the pathways diverge, I think, the comparisons between Detroit and Phoenix, although I think it's still an instructive comparison in some way. Of all the Sun Belt cities, Phoenix is more eligible as a candidate for being the 21st century Detroit than others.
You've spoken about the roles that city officials, mayors, and the like are kind of playing in the role in the future of the sustainable city. You've also talked about the role of artists and what they're doing in Phoenix. I was wondering if you could speculate on what you see are possible scenarios for architects to have in the future of Phoenix.
Yeah, I mean the architects who've been drawn into the green building movement were mostly active in single house commissions in the affluent regions, as you can imagine. And there were a lot of architects also who were drawn into the so-called downtown Renaissance. But the most sort of interesting adventures in adaptive reuse, let's say, were undertaken by a lot of the artist activists themselves, who became self-skilled, let's say, in a lot of the urban arts. I mean, beyond their own particular artistic field, and trained themselves as urbanists, which involved a lot of ramping up of knowledge about zoning and coding and certainly adaptive reuse in the downtown areas, which is, what a lot of artists are doing in downtown urban areas all across the U.S. But what was distinctive about these communities was that they formed a lot of alliances form coalitions with other urban groups, low-income groups, affordable housing groups, homeless groups, and so on and so forth, and in a way that you don't normally see, creatives forming those coalitions. And that was one of the things that interested me about the case study. And they were not about to be evicted, because they bought a lot of their own property. And they created at least 2 artist clusters, zones in just to the north of the city center and to the west, that were seen as artist communities in a way. So I guess my answer to the question is the architect, the passion and the energy for building and designing. The most interesting stuff was very organic, and it was coming from people who were not necessarily trained, credentialed as architects.
That seems like a particularly good spot. To finish with a double indictment of Phoenix.
Deprofessionalization.